Judgment me, yo, yeah. Sekejap bekerja, ucapkan judgment me, yo, yeah. Menjadi al-mumin, hargai mumin.
Hi and welcome to this continuing saga of benchmarking all of my graphics cards. One down, about 20 to go I think it is. The last time, for those of you who watched the video, I was going to bench 4 cards in one video, but decided that was probably a bit silly and decided to do one card at a time because some of them are quite interesting and worth a little look in their own, and it also gives me a chance to read up a bit of the history about each of these cards in turn. So far, the hard drive's been sorted out, cleared all the old drivers off for the 256, so it's just a case of getting the 256 out of the machine, saying goodbye to it. It was fun. And then replacing it with the Voodoo 3000. So this particular model is the one with the TV out, the Voodoo 3000 TV out with a little S-video, so you can run it into a TV, which is something I've never tried and probably should, so might do a little video about that at some point. I'm sure a lot of people are thinking this is a pretty unfair fight, but these cards were contemporary and that's all I really care about. So the Voodoo came out in April 1999, the 256 came out in October of 1999, and you can see from this magazine clipping that they were both being sold together for quite some time. This magazine's from October 2000, so this is a full year later, and you can still buy both cards, albeit that the 3DFX is probably very much the entry level at this point. Another interesting thing I found when I was sort of reading about this stuff was, there were pre-built machines coming out at the same time with both of these cards in. So there's this Micron machine here, which actually has the 256 SD-RAM version, which is the one that I looked at in the last video. And yet, in this very same comparison in this magazine, we've got another machine in a similar price range, but this one's got a Voodoo 3000. But the interesting thing here is that in their benchmarking, the Voodoo 3000 outperforms the GeForce 256 in one of their benches in Direct 3D, of all things. So in Expendable, it put out more frames than the 256. So it just goes to show you, it still had a bit of a fight in it. So I started off loading the drivers from this disk because I like using original disks, but it turned out to be a bad decision in a way, and it wasted a bit of time because this disk has version 1.03 of the drivers for the Voodoo 3 on it, and they turned out not to be very compatible with Voodoo tools or with the overclocking utility, and I wanted to load those up so that I could check that VSync was disabled because I wasn't sure. So I had to upgrade the driver to 1.07, which was the last official release, I think, for this card, and then I could load up Voodoo tools and the overclocking utility, and then I found out that I think in Direct 3D for this card, VSync is always disabled, so I didn't have to do anything, but if you want to use OpenGL, you need to go in and disable it using these tools. But as it turned out, I didn't have to do anything, I just wasted a bit of time, but I ended up with the most recent set of drivers anyway. Test itself is going to be exactly as it was with the 256, only difference is here, because Voodoo's only 16-bit color, I've only got half as much work to do, so that's cool. We're going to run 3D Mark 99 in 4 resolutions, those being 640 by 480, 800 by 600, 1024 by 768, and 1280 by 1024. Then we're going to run Unreal Tournament Benchmark for the same resolutions, and then we're going to run 3D Mark 2000 for the same resolutions, and then we'll finish up playing a bit of games with some fraps, frame counting going on, and see how it roughly compares to the 256. Okay, we're off. 3D Mark 99. And as the scores come in at 640 by 480, we've got a 3D Mark score of 7446, and we were getting kind of mid-70s frame rates in the game demos, so that's pretty good, about 75, 76 frames per second. 800 by 600, the 3D Mark score was 7097, and in the game demos again, we're getting just slightly lower scores, sort of around 70, early 70s, so still pretty good. Then at 1024 by 768, we got a 3D Mark score of 5381, and we're now getting kind of between, 45 and 62, 63. So still very playable frame rates, but dropping a little bit. And then finally at the highest resolution, 1280 by 1024, the 3D Mark score drops quite dramatically to 3367. And in the race game and the first-person shooter demos, we're getting about 30 frames a second for the race game and about 40, 41, 42 for the first-person shooter. So they're probably still playable frame rates. So at that sort of level of things in 3D Mark 99, the card holds its own, I think. Okay, next up we've got Unreal Tournament benchmark. So we're running this at the same resolutions as we did in 3D Mark 99. So let's see how we fare in this. Okay, next up we've got Unreal Tournament benchmark. So we're running this at the same resolutions as we did in 3D Mark 99. So let's see how we fare in this. So there is one subtle difference here. Not quite so subtle difference, is when I benched the 256, I was running it in Direct 3D, and of course this is a 3DFX card, so I'm running this benchmark in Glide, which is the only way you should run a 3DFX card if you can. So the results for this were at 640 by 480, we got 75 frames a second, 800 by 600, 70 frames a second, 1024 by 768, we got 54 frames a second, and 1280 by 1024 was 34 frames a second. So I'd say that is all pretty playable, even at the highest resolution. 34 frames a second is getting to the point where it might not be, but you would probably be okay playing that, I think. Final benchmark we're going to run is 3D Mark 2000, so I think this might prove possibly a little bit too much for this card, but we'll see how it gets on, and then after we've done this we'll do a little bit of a comparison with the 256 and see how they compete with each other. So the results are in for 3D Mark 2000. So this is probably going to be a bit much for this card, because I think this was really designed to push the new generation as it came through. So you're into DirectX 7 and you're into hardware TNL, all things which the Voodoo does not have. So the older generation cards like the Savage 4 and the Rage 128, the Voodoo and the TNT 2 might all struggle a little bit on this, but we'll find out about that in the future. But in the meantime, we got at a resolution of 640 by 480, we got a score of 4032. And we were getting playable frame rates in the adventure game and the helicopter game. In this benchmark, it splits them into high, low, and medium detail, but we were kind of getting 60 frames a second-ish on both at medium detail. Struggled a bit more at high detail. We're getting kind of 25 on the helicopter simulation and 37 on the adventure game. Moving on to 800 by 600, we're starting to see a bit more pressure put on the card here. So we've got a score of 3721, and the game demos at medium, we're still doing okay. We're getting 50s frame rates for both of the games, but high detail, you're beginning to struggle a little bit. We're still doing okay in the adventure game at about 37 frames a second, but we're below 20 now on the helicopter sim, with sort of 18 as the average. Moving on, 1024 by 768, we're getting a score of 2993, and we're still playable at medium detail on both of the games in the 40s, but at high detail it's slowly grinding to a halt. The helicopter game lost a few more frames. We're running at about 17 frames a second. The adventure game, 33 frames a second, so arguably still playable. Pushing the limits of technology now at 1280 by 1024, so we're getting a score of 1919, and at medium detail the two game demos are between 25 and 30 frames a second, so you're already borderline levels of playability, and at high level it's pretty much unplayable. It's only about 11 frames a second for the helicopter sim, 25 for the adventure game. But this is a benchmark, and it is, albeit a synthetic benchmark, it's pushing the hardware probably harder than normal gameplay would, unless you're playing very busy first-person shooters or stuff like that. I can well imagine that even in late 2000, most gamers playing on this card at sort of medium details probably wouldn't have a problem with it. So, looking at the specs, just before we have a look at comparing how the two cards performed in this particular benchmarking session, you can kind of tell this is the junction of a new generation, because the sort of the figures are all a bit all over the place, and it looks in some ways like the Voodoo's better than the GeForce, but it actually isn't. So, for example, the core clock is higher at 166 megahertz versus 120. The memory clock is higher at 166 versus 143, and it's got a faster memory bus, a wider memory bus at 128 bits versus 64 bits, and that all looks good until you start looking at some of the other stuff. And also the bandwidth is much higher, but you've got 2 more TMUs going on the GeForce, and you've also got these 4 pixel pipelines versus 1. And it's those pixel pipelines which I think are allocated 64 bits each. So it effectively ends up being a 256-bit wide pixel pipeline, which is where the 256 in the title comes from, as opposed to, well, I guess it's just going to be the single 128 on the Voodoo 3. And that kind of reveals itself when you look at the pixel rate and the texel rate down at the bottom there. Well, they're just way higher on the GeForce. So basically the GeForce, with its new fabrication process and its hardware texture and lighting that it could now fit onto the chip, it's pumping through a lot more information than the Voodoo is for each clock cycle. So I guess that's how it performs better in theory. But as I understand it, when these cards first came out, nobody was coding for hardware TNL anyway, so it took a good while for the technology to catch up. And by that time, this SDR version had been and gone, and the DDR version, which was much, much faster anyway, just because of the memory speed, was kind of storming away ahead of everybody else. So enough of me sounding like I know what I'm talking about. Let's move on and have a look at some graphs. So like I said, it's not really the aim of this video to compare these 2 cards. They just happen to be the only 2 cards I've benchmarked in this way, and they were roughly contemporary. And it's a nice one to do because it shows a generational jump from your pre-GPU cards to cards with hardware TNL on board, and ultimately much faster memory as well. But you can see here that the 256 is definitely a faster card in 3D Mark 99, while the Voodoo 3 performs perfectly adequately. All the frame rates were up there. You can definitely see that the future is here and things are running a little bit faster. As time advances, you see the jump much more pronounced. So here we're 3D Mark 2000. This card caters for all of the hardware bling that the GeForce has. It deals with hardware TNL and DirectX 7, and yeah, it's a much, much bigger gap, especially at high resolutions. I mean, look at that. It's up to sort of 10,000 3D marks on the GeForce, and it's, 2,000 and something on the Voodoo. So that was kind of the end of an era, I think. Unreal Tournament as well. I think just the raw horsepower of the GeForce makes it a considerably faster card, while I think the GeForce in most cases is totally playable, possibly not at the higher resolutions, but certainly 800 by 600 it was giving a good show of itself. But yeah, it does. It shows you the jump. It's a shame. I'd like to get a TNT2 Ultra in there. I think it'd be a bit quicker and possibly closer, but at some point in the future, I'm sure I'll be able to do that in some way. So there you have it. That's pretty much the benchmarking done. I think these days, in retrospect, when you're retro collecting, a lot of people do tend to fixate on faster stuff. And if you, like when I did my poll as to which graphics cards you might want to review, as soon as you say Savage 4, you'll get people saying they're rubbish, rubbish, rubbish. But back in those days, I didn't really have much money and never had anything close to the top of the range graphics cards. In fact, I never even did that until I think it was the 1080 Ti just a few years ago. It was the first time that I'd ever bought the fastest graphics card going. And I'm still using that card now because I just simply don't need anything faster. So it goes to show you, in real terms, unless you're playing the cutting edge games at the fastest possible speeds and the highest possible resolutions, it doesn't really make much difference to your enjoyment of games. So I imagine a lot of people would have still been going out and spending £120 on a Voodoo 3 3000 in early 2000 rather than forking out twice as much money for a GeForce 256 and still having a great time playing games with it. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to dig out the same 2 games that I did in the last review. So we'll start off with Spirit of Speed 1937 and see how that looks on the Voodoo. when I first started playing this game, I did think this looks nicer on the Voodoo. I wasn't convinced, so this is the first chance I've had doing this editing now to bring up the GeForce side by side, and I've got to say it does. The colours on the Voodoo really pop, and the GeForce looks a little bit washed out in comparison. Though you can see just on raw horsepower, the GeForce is ahead. I think it probably averaged about 8 or 10 frames a second more than the Voodoo. This game's maximum resolution is 800 by 600. Everything's turned up to full, but I've got to say you don't notice the difference in just playing it. It feels smooth on the Voodoo. It looks better on the Voodoo, so I think I'd have to give the Voodoo a win on this one, despite the raw power of the 256. So the other game we played was Porsche 2000, Need for Speed Porsche 2000, and we'll give that a go on Voodoo and see how that compares frame-wise and image-wise to the 256 as well. So go now.
3, 2, 1, go!
Yeah, on this one, it's like the shoes on the other foot, because it looks much more brighter and vibrant on the GeForce than it does on the Voodoo. So, yeah, I don't know, this is a slightly later game, I think, as well, but the graphics, the car rendering is pretty poor in this game, I think. It just doesn't look quite as nice, but I think it is slightly better on the GeForce here. But certainly the environment, the outside, is much more vibrant. I don't know, it might just be because I think you can race at different times of the day here. I think it was more dusk on the Voodoo, so I think it probably isn't as clear cut as all of that, and I didn't have the settings exactly matched up to compare them. But if you look at the interior of the car, there seems to be slightly more detail on the GeForce, and the colours certainly pop, but I don't know if that's just because of, as I said, the timing. It looks more like dusk on the other one, and you can see the sun setting, whereas the Voodoo was running in broad daylight, so it wasn't a very good comparison. But either way, the frame rates weren't that different again. You're probably borderline on both of them. And performance-wise on Fraps, it looks fairly low. They tend to sit in the 20s, between 20 and 30, and it belies the gaming experience because it feels like a very smooth game to play. There's no juddering, doesn't seem to be any flickering, and the cars handle very well. But yeah, I'm not sure about that. I think it is an environment thing. I do think it is more dusk and darker in the just the environment that I'm running the Voodoo in, and I should have more carefully tried to match up things like weather and daytime and that kind of stuff. Whereas in the other game, you don't have any of those variables, so it's always the same regardless of how you play. I think I'll call this one a draw, and I'll give the Voodoo a win on the other one, just because I've got a soft spot for 3DFX, but no doubt, just looking at the sort of horsepower on this, as you get into more demanding games and games that take advantage of hardware and TNL, there's no doubt that the 256 is going to be the card to have. But that's pretty much it. It was just more of a fun comparison than a genuine comparison. I think if I ever get a TNT2 Ultra, that would be more realistic sort of upgrade from one generation to the other, whereas the TNT Ultra, I believe, pretty much didn't lose any performance over the 256 when it first came out, but as people developed more for hardware TNL and DDR came in, then it was a whole different world. But it was a fun little comparison, so I hope you've enjoyed watching it, and I hope it wasn't too tedious to have yet another Voodoo 3 video. Next time, I think I will do the Rage 128. I'm going to do another 2 videos like this, the Rage 128 and Savage Pro, and then get back to doing some other hardware stuff. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching it. Hope you consider giving me a thumbs up, leaving comments, whatever, and I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks very much for watching.